So I got a question on my Instagram story asking what are the key aspects of powerlifting programming? So I figured I'd answer that here. The very first thing is with any sort of strength and conditioning program, it's kind of like a recipe in that it's not just about what ingredients are going in, but also what quantities they are. So even if you had the flour or the sugar or the salt, if there was too much or too little of any of those things, it's still going to turn out to suck. The other big concept that I want to go over before we get into it is what factors influence muscular strength from a general physiology kind of definition. There's two big things. It's going to be muscular size and then how well your nervous system can utilize and recruit all of that at once. So we need our training program to both help us put on more muscle tissue and get better at that neurological component that's kind of like the skill component of strength. So your main lifts, training the squat, bench press, and deadlift, as well as the close variations of those movements, should mostly cover the neurological and skill kind of component of getting strong. And then we also want accessory exercises, movements other than those that are generally trained in higher rep ranges in order to help us put on that muscular size portion of getting stronger, as well as just taking us through different ranges of motion than just those three movements would, so that we maintain some more mobility and general resilience, reducing our likelihood of injury. The next big thing is the quantity of how much to be putting into your program. There's three big variables that we're looking at. It's going to be the frequency, how often you train that movement or muscle group throughout the week, the volume, how many total sets, and then intensity, how difficult that training is or what kind of weight you're using. And scaling those things is based on a few different factors. So your skill level, your age, your sex, your size, if you use PEDs or not, and then your training history. But the overarching thing of all of those different factors is going to be absolute load. So the heavier weights that you're lifting, the harder it's going to be to recover from. So whether you're really skilled, really big, if you use PEDs, any of those factors that increase how much weight you're able to lift generally means that your training is going to be more stressful and you're not going to be able to use as much frequency, as much volume, or as high intensities. In terms of steps to create a good powerlifting program, the first thing is going to be to analyze the needs of the athlete in question. So what kind of weak points do they have in their competition lifts and what kind of skill issues are happening. So for example, if they have a chest cave in their squat, whenever they go to stand up out of the hole, they're getting rounded over. That could not only be viewed as a skill issue in terms of not being able to keep that position very well, but also what kind of muscles are potentially weak. So the muscles between the shoulder blades, rhomboids, mid-traps, that kind of stuff could potentially be stronger, as well as the spinal erectors to help with maintaining that position. But you might also choose a variation of the main lift that emphasizes working on that, such as the safety bar squat, which is trying to round you over the whole time. So training both a variation of the main lift and accessory exercises that are going to emphasize and work on the things that you need should set you up for success. The next step is to distribute your training of the main lifts across the days that you have available during the week. So frequency wise, generally most people are going to want to squat somewhere in 1 to 3 days per week, bench press 2 to 4, and deadlift 1 to 2. But that's going to be determined based on those factors that we covered earlier. So you want to spread those main lift exposures out across the week. I wouldn't generally recommend doing your heaviest squat, bench, and deadlift all on the same day. You want to kind of space that out. So maybe your secondary kind of deadlift is paired with your heaviest squat and vice versa. And then consider how many rest days you had prior to that, or other days where you're training different body parts or different movements. So your heaviest main exposure of the week should probably be on a day where you've had a couple days prior where it was resting. So you'll notice the heaviest deadlift here is after a few days off from the previous deadlift, and that's true for all the big lifts. So once you've determined how you're going to space out your main lifts throughout the week, you want to go ahead and start filling in what kind of exercises you're going to do, starting biggest to smallest. So main lifts come first, then any sort of secondary exercises, gradually moving down towards those things like calf raises, lateral raises, bicep curls that could kind of fill in wherever. So you want to focus on the biggest stuff first to ensure that that's ending up where it should be, and you have room to fit that in, whereas the other things can kind of fill in the nooks and crannies as you have more time available. So a great analogy for this that I got from my time at Kabuki Strength is like you're filling up a jar. You would want to put the big rocks in first, and then some pebbles, and then pour in the sand, because that's going to use all the space really efficiently. Whereas if you filled it with sand and then pebbles and then rocks, there's all kinds of like open gaps and it's going to be overflowing. So put the big stuff in first before you get caught up in the little details. And ideally, you're training every major muscle group at least like twice per week. And then the last thing, but arguably most important, is make sure that there's a long-term plan for how you're going to progress all of these things. So the volume should start high and gradually decrease, whereas the intensity should start low and gradually increase. So you're starting out with more reps and less weight and ending up with less reps and more weight. This also pairs nicely with specificity. As you go from further away from the meet to moving towards it, you should get more and more specific. So things that more closely resemble the competition lift for lower reps. So a great example is if you were doing squats, you might start with a block of 5s and then a block of 3s and then a block of 1s, where throughout that block, there's 4 weeks. The first week is like RPE 7, the next week is RPE 8, the next week is RPE 9, and then there's a deload. So you're gradually pushing a little harder at this rep range and then dropping to a lower rep range that lets you use more weight, pushing a little harder until you've built up to really heavy singles. The same thing applies for your accessories. So if you did your first block using 12 to 15 as your rep range, the next block you could do 10 to 12, and then the last block 8 to 10. This means that you're gradually building up to using heavier weights. So that will probably feel better. A great example is if you were doing skull crushers. If you leapt straight into doing heavy sets of 8, that would probably hurt and not feel too great on your elbows. Whereas if you started at sets of 15 and gradually built up, then you're probably going to be able to handle that. A good powerlifting plan often looks pretty similar person to person because we're all training for the same 3 movements, squat, bench, and deadlift, as well as we're all the same animal. We've got the same joints and the same muscular system. But what should be individualized is the variations of the main lift that you're doing. Those should be specific to your needs and your weak points, as well as what accessories you're doing and how much of everything you're training. That should be specific to the factors we covered earlier and individual to you.